Alistair Caldwell raised his champagne glass in a ballroom that cost more than most neighborhoods and announced that his daughter would lose every dollar of her inheritance if she kept seeing Holden Avery, the single father everyone in the room had already decided was beneath her. Laughter rippled across the room like something rehearsed. Helena Blackwood smiled the smile of a woman who believed she had just crushed the last obstacle between herself and the Caldwell fortune. Marin did not flinch. She reached for Holden's hand instead, in front of everyone who mattered, while his 7-year-old daughter stood at his other side, holding on to the hem of his jacket, watching the entire room with enormous, steady eyes. What none of them knew was that the quiet man in the second-hand jacket controlled ports, railways, and power infrastructure worth more than the entire Caldwell empire. Before we find out what that one evening set in motion, tell me in the comments what city you are watching from tonight, so I can see how far this story travels. And if you believe quiet, decent people deserve to be seen, hit that subscribe button, because this story is for you. That morning, in a small apartment on the south end of Boston, Holden Avery had been trying to convince his daughter that the jacket was fine. "It has a hole," Piper said, pointing at the left elbow. "It does not have a hole. It has a thin part." She pressed her finger into the fabric to demonstrate. Thin parts become holes. Holden looked at the spot. She was right. The wool had worn almost transparent at the bend of the elbow, the kind of damage that came from years of leaning on drafting tables and rail yard fences. This jacket had belonged to Lydia before it belonged to him. She had worn it to job sites the year they met, back when she was the structural engineer and he was the one who could not stop looking at the way she held a blueprint like she was reading a letter from someone she respected. She had died 2 years ago, and Holden had kept the jacket the way he kept certain things, not because he could not afford a new one, but because some objects carry a weight that has nothing to do with fabric. "It is staying," he said. Piper sighed with the theatrical resignation of a 7-year-old who had made her position clear and accepted she would not win. She climbed onto the counter stool and ate her cereal while Holden knotted his tie, checking his reflection in the microwave door because the bathroom mirror was too small and too far from the kitchen to be practical. Every morning before he put the jacket on, Piper touched the collar once, quickly, the way someone touches a photograph before leaving a room. She had never explained why, and Holden had never asked. They both knew. "Are we going to the party tonight?" she asked. "We are. Will there be kids? Probably not. Will there be cake? Almost certainly." She considered this. "I will wear the blue dress." He smiled. She had one blue dress. It had been Lydia's favorite on her. Marin Caldwell had met Holden 8 months earlier on a rain-slicked platform where a century-old transit station was being torn apart and rebuilt. She was chief executive of Caldwell Transit Group, 36 years old, accustomed to consultants who spent more time complimenting her office than reading her blueprints. Holden walked the half-finished platform in work boots that had seen a decade of use, crouched beside a support column, and told her flatly that the load calculations on the eastern wing were wrong. Wrong enough to cost the company tens of millions if construction continued unchecked. Within an hour of cross-checking his numbers against her own engineers, she understood he was right. He had not known who she was when he walked onto that platform, and he did not change his manner 1 degree after learning her name. Something about the way he spoke stayed with her long after that first meeting. A plainness that felt almost foreign inside boardrooms built for flattery. He did not soften his findings to protect her ego, and he did not apologize for being right. And there was a certain relief in that for a woman who had spent her whole career surrounded by people angling for her approval. Over the following months, something quieter than romance took root between them, built out of ordinary things rather than declarations. Dinners at a diner near the rail yard where nobody recognized either of them, the coffee always lukewarm, and the pie always better than it had any right to be. Dawn inspections at construction sites when the fog still clung to the tracks. Long conversations that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the kind of life each of them actually wanted. Holden told her about Piper's science projects with the same seriousness he gave to structural tolerances. He described how she had spent 3 weeks building a model bridge out of popsicle sticks for a school competition, testing its weight capacity with canned goods from the kitchen until the table looked like a small grocery store, and how the bridge had held 14 cans before finally cracking, and how she had studied the crack with the same expression Holden himself wore when inspecting a failed joint. Maren found herself laughing more freely than she had in years. There were quieter moments, too. Evenings when Maren sat at his kitchen table doing paperwork while Piper practiced piano scales in the next room. And the tightness she usually carried in boardrooms loosened somewhere between the coffee and the ordinary music of a life that had nothing to do with mergers or shareholders. What Maren did not know was the full shape of Holden Avery's life. He told her he had once founded an engineering firm and now lived off consulting work and a handful of investments, which was true in the way that a single brick is true about a house. He never lied. He simply never mentioned that a holding company called Ironwood Holdings answered to him alone, controlling ports, railways, and power infrastructure across half the country, with a total value that approached $10 billion. He had stepped back from public life entirely after Lydia died, choosing to raise Piper on his own, preferring job sites and drafting tables to boardrooms and press releases. He had not hidden his wealth out of shame, but because he refused to let every relationship in his life be quietly reassessed the moment people learned what he was worth. He had watched it happen once, in the months after Lydia's death, when old friends suddenly wanted to help in ways that felt less like kindness and more like positioning. He had stopped answering those calls and never started again. The evening before the Caldwell family anniversary gala, standing in his cluttered home office with blueprints spread across the desk and Piper's laughter drifting in from the kitchen, Holden took a call about Ironwood's plan to renew a substantial credit line for Caldwell Transit. He told the voice on the other end not to sign anything yet. "I want to see how they treat someone," he said quietly, "when they believe that someone has no power at all." The Caldwell estate sat behind iron gates and a half-mile of manicured hedges outside Boston, the kind of property that made visitors lower their voices without being told. Holden arrived in his old pickup truck with Piper in the passenger seat in her blue dress, holding a small clutch purse she had packed herself with a granola bar, a pen, and a folded drawing she intended to give Maren if the evening went well. The security detail at the gate directed them toward the service entrance, certain that no genuine guest of Maren Caldwell could possibly arrive looking like this. Inside, Helena Blackwood intercepted the guest list before Maren could reach it and handed Holden a contractor badge instead of a visitor pass, calling it an easy mistake to make. She held it out with 2 manicured fingers as though she could not bring herself to touch his hand while passing it over. Piper looked up at the badge, then at the woman, then at her father, with the quiet alertness of a child who understood that something unkind had just happened even if she could not name the mechanism. Holden folded the badge into the pocket of Lydia's jacket and told Maren, who had arrived at the gate furious, that it did not matter. He had not come for a title printed on plastic. He squeezed her hand once, a gesture meant to steady her rather than himself, and the 3 of them walked through the doors together. Inside the ballroom, beneath chandeliers that cost more than most homes, Helena began her interrogation disguised as small talk. She asked what Holden earned in a year, which neighborhood he called home, whether he was hoping Marin might cover his daughter's tuition, and whether he understood that the watch on Alistair's wrist was worth more than the truck he arrived in. A waiter passed with champagne, and Helena took 2 glasses without offering one to Holden. Piper, standing at her father's hip in her blue dress, watched the woman take 2 glasses and give none. She did not say anything. She did not tug on her father's sleeve or ask why. But something in the child's face settled into an expression older than her years, the look of a girl who had just learned something about the world she had not expected to learn tonight, and who had decided, quietly and completely, that she did not agree with it. Holden answered each question without heat. "Piper has her own education fund," he said. "I have never asked Marin for $1 toward anything in my life. And if the value of a man is measured by the watch on someone else's wrist, that is a system I am happy to fail." His calm only sharpened Helena's contempt, and soon she was introducing him to investors as the man who fixes railroads, tilting her head as though the phrase itself were an insult, suggesting to anyone who would listen that Marin was simply passing through a rebellious phase that would resolve itself the moment she remembered what she stood to lose. Then, Alistair demanded that Marin clarify the relationship in front of the assembled guests. When Marin confirmed that Holden was the man she intended to build a future with, the room went silent with the particular quiet that only old money can manage. Helena produced a folder she had prepared days in advance, a revised trust resolution that would strip Marin of her inheritance on the grounds of conduct damaging to the family's reputation. Alistair delivered his ultimatum without hesitation, his voice carrying over the string quartet that had gone abruptly quiet. "End it tonight, or lose everything that carries the Caldwell name." Marin turned toward Holden, searching his face for some sign of what he wanted her to do. He offered no plea, no argument for himself. He simply held her gaze and let the silence stretch until it belonged to her alone. "Do not choose this for me," he said quietly. "Choose the life you can live with when you look back on tonight." Piper tugged on her father's sleeve. He looked down. She was holding his hand with both of hers, the way she held things she had decided were not allowed to leave. She did not say a word. She did not need to. Marin turned back to her father and told him, in a voice that did not shake, that she would not hand the direction of her life over to a document drafted by people who had never once asked what she wanted. Alistair signed the resolution on the spot. Helena read the consequences aloud with visible satisfaction. Nearly $700 million in inheritance, voting shares, family properties, the charitable board seat, every thread of financial support the family had ever extended, all of it gone. As the crowd began to disperse, Helena approached Holden and told him that Marin had just traded an empire for a man who could not afford to buy the room they were standing in. Holden looked at her without a trace of anger. "You are confusing the inheritance of money with the capacity to create value," he said. "A distinction I suspect you have never needed to learn." Marin left the estate that night with Holden and Piper, one hand in his and one hand in the child's. Nobody moved to stop them. In the truck on the way home, Piper fell asleep against her father's shoulder in her blue dress, the folded drawing still tucked inside her clutch purse, and Marin reached across the seat and held Holden's hand in the dark without speaking, because there was nothing left to say that the last hour had not already said for them. By midnight, Helena had leaked a version of events to the press describing Holden as an unemployed single father exploiting a wealthy young executive. By morning, Caldwell Transit stock had dipped on rumors of family instability. Helena immediately used the decline to question Marin's fitness to lead. framing a single personal choice as evidence of poor judgment across the board. An emergency board meeting was called with a single agenda item: the review of Marin's position as chief executive. Marin was forced out of the family apartment within days. Helena made certain the process was as public as possible, sending representatives to reclaim the car, the membership cards, and every possession registered to the family trust. Marin moved into a small apartment near company headquarters, thin walls, a radiator that clanked at odd hours, a window that looked out onto a parking lot. She found herself sleeping better there than she had in years, which told her something about the house she had grown up in that she had not been ready to hear before. Holden helped her arrange the apartment, cooked dinner most nights on a stove that occasionally forgot how to light, and sat beside her for hours going over financial documents ahead of the board meeting that could end her career. Piper did her homework on the kitchen floor, with crayons spread around her like a small, colorful barricade, and sometimes looked up and asked Marin questions about work with the enormous sincerity of a child who believed adult problems could be solved if you just thought about them hard enough. One night, she drew a picture of the three of them sitting at a table covered in papers and taped it to the refrigerator without asking permission. And neither Holden nor Marin took it down, because it was the most accurate portrait of their life anyone had ever made. There was something almost domestic about the whole arrangement. Boxes of takeout by the sink. Papers across a secondhand table. The three of them working in comfortable silence long after midnight while the radiator ticked its uneven rhythm against the wall. Holden offered to resolve the financial pressure quietly. Marin refused. She told him she needed to prove to her father and to herself that she could protect the company she had built her career on through competence rather than through the resources of a man she loved. Holden respected that decision more than he let on, watching her pack files into a second-hand car with the same quiet pride he felt watching Piper study for exams. He understood that what Marin needed right now was not a rescue, but a witness. Someone who would stand beside her while she proved to herself that her value had never depended on a last name printed on a trust document. While reviewing the transit division's financial statements late one night, Marin noticed a merger being quietly advanced with a firm called Blackwood Capital, one that would strip Caldwell Transit of control over several of its most valuable freight corridors. Around the same time, an obscure private fund called Ironwood Holdings began buying up Caldwell Transit bonds. Helena received a report naming Ironwood as the company's largest creditor within weeks, but nobody on her team could identify who controlled it. Helena engineered a liquidity crisis, threatening to suspend the credit facility the company depended on to make payroll. Thousands of employees stood to see their paychecks delayed. Entire freight lines risked grinding to a halt. Just before the deadline, Ironwood Holdings extended new financing and guaranteed every outstanding payment, pulling the company back from the edge. The terms included protections for hourly workers and a clause barring the use of company assets to secure any loan connected to Blackwood Capital. Ruth Keene, the company's longtime chief financial officer, helped Marin dig through years of internal records and uncovered tens of millions of dollars funneled from Caldwell Transit into consulting firms with direct ties to the Blackwood family. Invoices for work never performed. Retainers paid to firms with no verifiable staff. Ruth, who had spent 2 decades protecting the company's books with a kind of fierce, unglamorous loyalty, did not bother hiding her anger once the picture became clear, her pen tapping sharply against the table each time she uncovered another falsified line item. She had trained half the accountants who still worked in that building, and the betrayal cut in a way that went beyond professional outrage. Helena made one last offer before the board could convene, the kind of offer designed to look generous while being nothing of the sort. She promised Marin her full inheritance back, every dollar, every property, every voting share, if she publicly ended things with Holden, resigned as chief executive, and voiced support for the Blackwood merger. The proposal told Marin everything she needed to understand about her aunt's true priorities. Holden had never been the real target, only a convenient excuse dressed up as a moral objection, a costume for a plan that had been in motion long before he ever walked onto that train platform. She refused without hesitation, her voice steady even as her hands trembled slightly beneath the table. The night before the board meeting, Holden brought Marin to an unmarked office above a small engineering workshop she had passed dozens of times without noticing. Surrounded by drafting tables and half-finished models of bridge supports, he told her everything. He was the founder and controlling owner of Ironwood Holdings. His first engineering firm had not failed. It had become the technical foundation for freight systems used across dozens of states. His total fortune stood near $10 billion, kept almost entirely out of public view through a structure of holding companies most people would never think to question. He had hidden his wealth not out of shame, but because he refused to let every relationship in his life be quietly reassessed the moment people learned what he was worth. Marin sat with the weight of it for a long moment. The workshop smelled of machine oil and fresh sawdust, and somewhere in the back a radio played low, forgotten beneath the weight of what he was telling her. She watched his hands as he spoke, the same calloused, careful hands that had adjusted blueprints on that first rainy platform, and found it strange that they belonged to a man capable of moving markets with a single signature. She asked him whether he had feared she would love him differently once she knew the truth. He admitted he feared both outcomes equally, being loved more because of the money, and being loved less in spite of it, and that the fear had followed him for years without ever finding an easy answer. Marin decided that his identity would be revealed only when the law required it, and that she alone would face Helena in that boardroom on her own terms. The board convened inside the very building where the Caldwell family had once laughed at the man standing in a contractor badge. Helena opened by portraying Marin as an unstable executive whose personal choices had damaged shareholder confidence beyond repair. Alistair stood beside his sister, convinced that sacrificing his daughter was the only way left to save the company his father had built. Just as the vote was about to begin, Holden walked into the room dressed exactly as he had been the night they mocked him at the gala, Lydia's jacket worn at the elbows, Piper at his side in her blue dress, holding his hand. Helena ordered security to remove him. He placed a folder on the table and stated without raising his voice exactly what Ironwood Holdings now controlled: the majority of Caldwell Transit's outstanding corporate bonds. Veto power over any transaction altering the company's pledged assets. A strategic accumulation of shares built lawfully over several years. And the right to terminate licensing on core logistics technology if the company were transferred without proper authorization. Board counsel spent 20 minutes reviewing the documents before confirming that every filing was legitimate. Helena insisted he was merely an employee acting on someone else's behalf, until Holden turned to the final page where the beneficial owner of Ironwood Holdings was listed in plain black type. Holden Barrett Avery. The room fell into a silence heavier than the one at the gala months earlier. Every guest who had laughed behind their champagne glasses 6 months ago, every board member who had voted without thinking, every person in this company who had looked at a worn jacket and decided the man inside it was not worth their attention, sat with the full weight of that miscalculation pressing down on them like something physical. Alistair finally understood that the man he had dismissed as unworthy controlled a fortune that dwarfed everything the Caldwell family had spent generations building. Holden did not gloat. "You judged me by the truck I drove," he said, his voice as calm as it had been the night Helena first questioned him. "And that is exactly how you judge your employees, your vendors, and anyone who cannot make you richer. It is not a philosophy. It is just contempt wearing a nicer coat." Piper stood beside him, holding his hand, watching the room with the same enormous steady eyes she had worn all evening. She did not understand the numbers on the table. She understood that her father was standing up in a room full of people who had been unkind to him, and that he was doing it without raising his voice, which was the way he did everything. At one point during the silence that followed, she looked up at Marin and gave her a small nod, the way her father gave small nods, and Marin felt something tighten in her chest that had nothing to do with the vote. Marin rose and presented the findings she and Ruth had spent weeks assembling, laying out how Helena had systematically undervalued the company's core assets, redirected contracts to Blackwood, affiliated shell firms, engineered an artificial liquidity crisis, and prepared to sell off vital freight corridors far below their true worth. Ruth confirmed under questioning that every transaction had been deliberately hidden from the company's independent audit committee. When the vote closed, Marin retained her position as chief executive. The Blackwood merger was formally terminated. Helena was stripped of every remaining authority. An independent investigation was opened into her conduct. Ironwood's recapitalization plan was approved without further objection. Helena left the building that day through the same doors she had once walked through with such certainty, her heels echoing against marble that no longer felt like it belonged to her. The woman who had once used inheritance as a weapon now found herself locked out of the very empire she had spent years trying to seize. There was no dramatic ending for her. Just a woman walking to a car that was no longer waiting where she expected it to be, her phone already filling with calls she would spend weeks deciding whether to return. Alistair eventually made his way to Holden's workshop, startled to find him still wearing the same worn jacket, repairing a piece of machinery himself rather than sitting behind a desk in a glass tower. He offered to restore Marin's inheritance in full and asked, almost humbly, whether she might return to the family as though none of it had happened. Marin refused the easy version of reconciliation. She laid out 3 conditions, speaking slowly enough that there could be no mistaking her seriousness. The family trust would be placed under independent management, with no further power to interfere in an heir's personal life. Alistair would publicly acknowledge how he had used the company to punish his own daughter. And a portion of the family's assets would be dedicated to protecting employee pensions and benefits. A condition that had nothing to do with her own future, and everything to do with the people who had kept the company running while the family fought over its spoils. When Alistair asked Holden whether he felt satisfied, having proven he was wealthier than the entire Caldwell family combined, Holden answered quietly that he had never needed to prove anything of the sort. "I only needed you to understand," he said, "that your daughter never became poor the day she chose me." Piper was sitting on the workshop floor drawing while the adults talked, and at some point during the conversation she stood up and walked over to Alistair, who had never once spoken to her directly. She held out a folded piece of paper. Inside was the drawing she had packed in her clutch purse the night of the gala, the one she had intended to give Marin if the evening went well. 3 stick figures standing together, 2 tall and 1 small, and beneath them, in careful 7-year-old handwriting, the word family. She had been carrying it since that night, waiting for the right moment. Alistair looked at the drawing for a long time. His hands, which had signed away a $700 million inheritance without trembling, shook slightly, holding a piece of paper that weighed nothing at all. Then he looked at his daughter, and at the man in the worn jacket, and at the child who had just handed him something he did not know how to earn. He did not cry. But he came closer to it in that workshop than he had in 30 years, and the fact that a 7-year-old girl in a blue dress had managed what no boardroom, no fortune, and no amount of family pride had ever accomplished was not lost on anyone in the room. 6 months later, Caldwell Transit had stabilized under Marin's leadership. Its board was genuinely independent. Every Blackwood contract was dissolved. Employee protection programs had been expanded further than they had ever reached. Workers on the loading docks noticed the difference in small, tangible ways: faster equipment repairs, clearer communication from management. A company that finally felt like it was being run for the people inside it, rather than around them. Marin accepted her restored inheritance, but moved the voting power into a governance trust with real oversight, refusing to let it become a leash around her life again. Alistair began the slow work of repairing his relationship with his daughter, showing up unannounced with coffee instead of demands, learning to sit in silence when silence was what she needed. It was not the relationship either of them had once imagined, but it was honest in a way their old one had never managed to be. Holden continued running Ironwood with the same quiet discretion he always had, still spending most days on job sites and drafting tables rather than in corner offices. He never moved to acquire Caldwell Transit, though he could have done so effortlessly, choosing instead to respect the career Marin had built with her own hands. On the nights when Piper fell asleep on Marin's couch after dinner, a regular occurrence by now, Holden would carry her to the car, and Marin would walk them to the door and stand there a moment longer than necessary, and neither of them would name what was growing between the three of them, because it was already, quietly and completely, a family. At the following year's anniversary gala, held in the same ballroom where he had once been handed a contractor badge, Holden arrived wearing Lydia's jacket. The same thin spot at the elbow. The same dent in the pocket where the badge had once been folded. Piper was beside him in a new dress she had picked out herself, and she walked through those doors holding her father's hand with the confidence of a child who had watched him stand up in a room that tried to make him small, and had decided that was the kind of person she intended to become. The room fell silent the moment he walked through the door, the silence carrying a different weight entirely this time, something closer to reckoning than ridicule. Marin crossed the floor without hesitation, her heels loud against the marble, and took his hand in front of every person who had once looked down on him. "A year ago in this very room I lost my inheritance," she said quietly. Holden looked at her. "You lost nothing that mattered, only the price they tried to place on your obedience." Somewhere across the ballroom, Alistair watched his daughter laugh freely for the first time in longer than he could remember, and understood, perhaps for the first time in his life, that everything he had once measured in dollars had never been the thing worth protecting at all. He raised his glass quietly, not toward the room, but toward the two of them, a private acknowledgement nobody else in that crowd would ever notice or understand. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, the weight of the Caldwell name felt like something he wanted to carry rather than something he needed to protect. And Piper, standing between them in her new dress, reached up and took one of each of their hands, the same way she had the night they walked out of this building a year earlier. She looked up at her father and said, with the total confidence of a 7-year-old who has seen the world test someone she loves and watched him pass, "The jacket still looks fine, Dad." Holden smiled. "I know, kid, so let me ask you something tonight. Has anyone ever looked at the person you love and decided they were not enough, based on nothing but what they could see on the surface? Tell me about it in the comments. I read every one. And if this story stayed with you, you know what to do." New stories every week.